frantic call to the emergency operator in force.
It was just the two of them in the house. We didn't know if she was injured or hurt. She was pretty hysterical, covered with blood, pretty distraught, obviously.
A murder investigation reveals a series of shocking events.
A Lorain County man was murdered in his home. His family continues their search for answers and a killer.
In the quiet hours before dawn, when the world is supposed to be safest, a single gunshot shattered the illusion of security inside a rural Ohio home. Moments later, a woman's voice trembled through a 911 call, confused, frantic, pleading for help. Her husband had been shot while sleeping beside her. There were no screams beforehand, no alarms triggered, no forced entry, just one man dead in his own bed and one woman alive to tell the story. At first, it looked like a nightmare caused by an unknown intruder, someone who slipped past barking dogs, bypassed security systems, left no fingerprints, and vanished without a trace. A perfect crime. Too perfect. Because as investigators would soon realize, this house was not ordinary. The couple inside it was heavily armed, obsessively security conscious, and surrounded by safeguards designed to stop exactly this kind of threat. And yet, every one of those defenses had failed, silently. For years, the case went cold. Rumors spread, families fractured, suspicions simmered beneath the surface, and the woman who survived continued her life, insisting she had nothing to hide. Until one discovery forced detectives to reopen the file. A document. A computer search was made just hours before the murder, a pattern of details that no longer fit the story they had been told. What followed was not a dramatic confession, but something far more unsettling, a slow unraveling. A case built not on what was found, but on what was missing. No DNA, no forced entry, no credible stranger. Only two people were inside the house that night, and only one of them walked out alive. This is not a story about a masked killer in the dark. This is the chilling true case of how lies can survive for years, and how the truth, once exposed, can be impossible to escape. In the early morning hours of November 18, 2009, the stillness of rural Ohio was broken by panic. At just after 6 a.m., a woman dialed 911, her voice strained, breathless, struggling to keep control. Her name was Julene Simcoe. She told the dispatcher that her husband had been shot. Inside a modest home on the outskirts of Vermilion, Ohio, first responders would soon find a scene that made no sense, one that would haunt investigators for nearly a decade. When police arrived, they were led upstairs to the bedroom. There, lying on the bed, was 36-year-old Jeremy Simcoe, Julene's husband of 10 years. He was already dead. Jeremy had been shot once, execution style, in the back of the head at point-blank range. The wound was instantly fatal. There were no signs of a struggle in the bedroom. No overturned furniture, no broken glass, no forced entry anywhere in the home. The house was quiet, too quiet, and Julene, the only other adult inside the home, was alive. Julene told police she had been sleeping on the third floor of the house when she heard a loud noise. At first, she assumed Jeremy was awake, possibly firing a gun out the window to scare off animals, a common practice on their rural property. Jeremy and Julene owned a tree service business and lived on a large, semi-isolated property near Lake Erie. They owned multiple firearms, had concealed carry permits, and were no strangers to gunfire. According to Julene, she went downstairs after hearing the noise. She said she entered the bedroom and saw Jeremy lying on the bed, apparently asleep. When she tried to wake him, she felt something wet, blood. Then she claimed she heard movement in the hallway. Panicked, Julene said she grabbed a 9mm handgun from her dresser and fired 2 shots toward the doorway. Warning shots, she insisted, before locking the bedroom door, attempting CPR, and calling 911. That was her story. And at first, it sounded plausible. But as investigators began processing the scene, doubts surfaced almost immediately. The dogs, 5 of them, were tied up outside in the backyard. These were not small pets. They were large territorial animals, known to bark aggressively at strangers. None of the neighbors reported hearing barking that night, not a single one. Even more troubling, the Simcoes had multiple security measures, motion sensors, door alarms, a driveway alert system designed to notify them if anyone approached the property. None of those alarms had been triggered. There was no forced entry, no broken locks, no smashed windows, no damaged doors. Whoever entered that house, if anyone did, had done so silently, invisibly, and without leaving evidence behind. Then there was the weapon. A .357 Magnum, one of Jeremy's own guns, was found lying on the kitchen floor. It had fired exactly 1 round. 5 live rounds remained in the cylinder, but the gun was clean. No blood, no tissue, no blowback. For a gun fired inches from a man's head, that made no sense. It suggested the weapon had been wiped down after the shot. Who would have time to do that? And why? Julene, meanwhile, appeared distraught. Officers described her as emotional, overwhelmed, and disoriented. She was taken to the hospital when she struggled to calm down. Over the course of that day, she gave 4 statements: at the house, at the hospital, and later at her mother's home. Each version was largely consistent. She maintained that an intruder must have entered the home and killed her husband. But as days turned into weeks, investigators realized something unsettling. There was no evidence of an intruder, only theories. Police chased every lead. A stranger reportedly seen walking nearby days earlier, a neighbor who once argued with Jeremy, a contractor who had threatened him during a dispute. Each lead collapsed under scrutiny. Alibis checked out. Timelines didn't match. Evidence went nowhere. The case stalled, and slowly, it went cold. For Jeremy's family, the pain only deepened. Tensions rose between them and Julene. Memorials were held separately. Relationships fractured. Suspicion simmered beneath polite silence. Julene eventually put the house up for sale. To some, it felt like she was trying to move on too quickly. To others, it felt like she was trying to bury something. 7 months passed, then a year. Behind the scenes, investigators never stopped working. They re-examined evidence, reread statements, replayed the 911 call. They listened, not just to what Julene said, but how she said it. And slowly, the picture began to change, not because of what was found, but because of what wasn't. No foreign DNA, no forced entry, no credible stranger. Only 2 people in the house, one dead, one alive. And a story that required far too many coincidences to be true. By 2013, detectives believed they had uncovered something that changed everything, something buried in the couple's personal files, something that reframed their relationship, their past, and the night Jeremy died. So they called Julene back in, 4 years after the murders. Detectives decided it was time to bring Julene Simcoe back in, not as a suspect, at least not officially, but as a widow being asked to clarify details. She arrived at the station with her attorney, calm, composed, and confident that her story had already survived years of scrutiny. But this interview was different. This time, investigators weren't searching for answers. They were searching for contradictions. They began gently. They asked Julene to walk them through the day before the murder, November 17th, 2009. She described a normal routine: yard work, preparing pumpkins, watching television, talking about future plans. Nothing unusual, nothing tense, nothing worth remembering. When asked what time they went to bed, she couldn't say. When asked who locked the doors, she wasn't sure. When asked about the dogs, how far their chains reached, whether they barked, her answers grew vague. I don't know. I don't remember. It depends. Individually, these gaps seemed harmless. Together, they began to matter. Julene insisted that she and Jeremy had a good marriage. Yes, they argued occasionally, like any couple, but there was no violence, except for one incident early in the marriage, when Jeremy slapped her and she hit him back. That was the end of it, she said, but investigators had already spoken to people who described Jeremy as volatile, aggressive, and controlling, a man who yelled at workers, intimidated others, and had a reputation for anger. Still, Julene stood by her version, until the timeline turned critical. She explained that during the night the dogs barked, waking Jeremy. He went outside, tied them up, and came back in. Later, he was restless and took another sleeping pill. Eventually, she said, she went upstairs to sleep on the 3rd floor because his snoring kept her awake. Then came the sound, a loud noise, not a gunshot, at least not how she described it. Just something loud. That detail stuck with investigators. Julene claimed she assumed Jeremy was awake and shooting at animals, something he allegedly did often. But this raised a serious question. Why would a man fire a gun inside or near the house while his wife was sleeping upstairs? And if he had fired the gun himself, why was he later found shot execution style in bed? The questioning became more precise. When Julene entered the bedroom, she said Jeremy looked asleep. She touched him. I felt blood. Then I heard a noise in the hallway. She grabbed her 9mm handgun and fired toward the doorway. Then she locked the bedroom door. Then she returned to Jeremy. That sequence troubled investigators. If she believed an intruder was inside the house, why lock herself in with a dying man instead of fleeing? And why lock the door at all unless it was already locked? Then came the guns. The weapon that killed Jeremy, a .357 Magnum, was found clean. No blood, no tissue, no trace of a point-blank gunshot. Julene claimed she had no idea how that could be, but when asked about cleaning guns, she admitted she sometimes helped Jeremy do exactly that. And yet, neither the murder weapon nor her own 9mm had any blood on them, despite her saying she touched Jeremy's wounds in a dark room without turning on the lights. That didn't add up. Then investigators shifted gears. They asked about security. Julene agreed they were a security-conscious couple. They had alarms on doors, sensors on the driveway, dogs that barked loudly at any disturbance, yet none of those systems had activated. No alarms, no barking, no witnesses, and despite claiming an intruder entered through the back door, that door showed no fingerprints from Jeremy, who supposedly used it every night. Only Julene's DNA was present. The pressure mounted. Investigators began outlining their logic plainly. Two people in the house. One ends up dead, no evidence of forced entry, no credible intruder. Typically, one detective said, that makes the survivor the prime suspect. Julene listened. She didn't argue. She didn't panic. She simply deflected. You're the experts, she said. Then came the turning point. The reason she had been called back after 4 years. Investigators placed a document in front of her. A handwritten 14-page agreement. Julene claimed the relationship was consensual, that she participated willingly, that it had nothing to do with the murder, but detectives weren't convinced. They weren't judging her lifestyle. They were questioning the motive. Then came the final blow. Computer records. 11 hours before Jeremy was killed, someone on their home computer searched for Julene's father's obituary, the same father who abused her, the same father whose trauma lingered beneath everything. Julene denied making the search. She demanded proof. The investigators had it, a timestamp, a URL, a digital trail. Why would anyone search for her father's obituary hours before Jeremy's death? And why now? The implication was chilling, that the past had resurfaced, that the power dynamic in her marriage mirrored her childhood trauma, and that something inside Julene had finally snapped. She never confessed, not then, not ever. But by the end of the interview, detectives no longer needed one. The intruder theory had collapsed. There were too many. The silences are too loud. What they now believed was this. Jeremy Simcoe wasn't killed by a stranger. He wasn't the victim of a burglary gone wrong. He was shot by the person who knew the house best. The person who knew where the guns were. The person who could move unseen. The person who survived. The case that once seemed impossible was suddenly clear. It would take one more piece of evidence, and a courtroom, to finish it. But the truth was already closing in. By the time Julene Simcoe left the interrogation room in 2013, detectives knew something critical had changed. They didn't have a confession. They didn't have new physical evidence, but they had something just as powerful, a narrative that finally made sense. For years, Jeremy Simcoe's murder had defied logic. An invisible intruder, a silent house, a gun wiped clean, dogs that never barked, alarms that never sounded. But when investigators stepped back and removed the idea of a stranger entirely, the pieces fell into place, slowly, relentlessly. And by December 19, 2014, more than 5 years after Jeremy's death, the state of Ohio was ready to act. Julene Simcoe was indicted. The charges were severe: aggravated murder, felonious assault, tampering with evidence. The woman who had once been seen as a grieving widow was now officially accused of killing her husband, and the case prosecutors built against her was unlike any other. There was no eyewitness, no murder weapon with blood, no confession. Instead, the state relied on something far more difficult to explain away: the totality of evidence. Prosecutors began with the crime scene. Jeremy Simcoe was shot at point-blank range in the back of the head while lying in bed. There were no defensive wounds, no struggle, no signs he ever woke up. That alone suggested trust. Whoever pulled the trigger was someone he didn't fear, someone he didn't hear approaching. Then came the guns. The .357 Magnum, Jeremy's own firearm, had fired one shot. It was found in the kitchen, wiped clean, free of blood or tissue. Experts testified that this was inconsistent with a close-range execution unless the gun had been cleaned afterward. An intruder fleeing for his life would not stop to wipe down a weapon, but someone with time and control might. Next came the house itself. Jurors learned about the Simcoes' extensive security measures: dogs, alarms, sensors, warning signs. And yet, on the night of the murder, no alarms activated, no dogs barked, no neighbors heard anything, no forced entry was found. The prosecution argued this wasn't a failure of security, it was evidence of familiarity. Then came the digital trail. The search for Julene's father's obituary, made 11 hours before the murder, was presented as a psychological trigger. Prosecutors didn't claim it proved motive on its own. They argued it revealed a state of mind, that something buried had resurfaced, and that the dynamics inside the Simcoe marriage, especially the dominant submissive relationship, had reached a breaking point. Witness after witness took the stand. Former clients described Jeremy as controlling and verbally abusive toward Julene. Friends spoke of volatility inside the marriage. An ex-boyfriend described Julene as manipulative. A nurse from the hospital testified that Julene may have said, "I shot my husband," a statement Julene denied, calling it a misunderstanding. But to prosecutors, it was one more crack in her version of events. Then came the 911 call. Experts testified that Julene's call showed multiple indicators of deception. She claimed to be performing CPR, but audio analysis suggested she was not. Her phrasing, sentence order, and emotional responses did not match those of innocent callers in similar situations. This wasn't definitive proof, but it added weight. Perhaps most damaging of all was what wasn't presented by the defense. Julene chose a bench trial, meaning there would be no jury, only a judge, and the defense made a shocking decision. They called no witnesses, not one. After reviewing all the evidence, the court delivered its verdict. On October 20th, 2017, nearly 8 years after Jeremy Simcoe was killed, the judge spoke the words Julene had avoided for almost a decade: guilty. The court found that the evidence proved beyond a reasonable doubt that Julene Simcoe murdered her husband and attempted to conceal it. She was sentenced to 28 years in prison. For 5 years after the murder, Julene had lived freely. She had sold the house, dated other men. I tried to move on. Now she was being led away in handcuffs. Her appeal would later be denied. The conviction would stand. Today, Julene Simcoe remains incarcerated at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. Jeremy's family, who never had the chance to reconcile with him, finally have answers, though no sentence can replace what was taken. This was not a case solved by a single piece of evidence. It was solved by absence, by silence, by a story that could not survive scrutiny, and by the simple truth that when a crime scene offers no room for an outsider, the answer is often already inside the house. When the courtroom emptied and the sentence was handed down, there was no celebration, no sense of victory, only silence. Because in cases like this, justice does not feel triumphant, it feels heavy. Jeremy Simcoe was gone for nearly 8 years before the truth finally caught up with the person responsible. Gone without ever knowing that the story told in his name would unravel piece by piece. For 5 long years, his death was treated as a mystery, a perfect crime, a tragedy without answers. While investigators worked quietly in the background, Julene Simcoe lived freely, selling the house, dating again, insisting she was a victim of circumstance. But lies, no matter how carefully constructed, have a shelf life. They fracture under pressure, they collapse under detail, and eventually they expose themselves through what they cannot explain. There was no masked intruder, no silent phantom slipping past alarms and barking dogs, no stranger capable of executing a man in his own bed, cleaning the weapon, and vanishing without a trace. There was only a marriage built on volatility, a past marked by trauma, and a moment when control, resentment, and opportunity converged. The court did not convict Julene Simcoe because of one piece of evidence. It convicted her because every path led back to her. The locked doors, the wiped gun, the missing alarms, the digital footprints, the words spoken, and the words avoided. Together, they told a story no stranger could fit into. Today, Julene Simcoe remains behind bars, her appeal denied, her version of events officially rejected by the justice system. Jeremy's family is left with grief, but also with answers they waited years to receive. And perhaps the most chilling lesson of all is this: some crimes don't announce themselves with chaos. They hide behind calm voices, routine mornings, and believable stories. They wait patiently, trusting that time will erase doubt. But time doesn't erase the truth, it sharpens it. Cases like this remind us that the most dangerous stories are often the quiet ones, the ones that unfold slowly, hidden behind familiarity and trust. If this case stayed with you, share your thoughts below. Do you believe the truth always comes out, or are there cases where it never does? Subscribe for more deeply researched true crime stories where every detail matters, because sometimes the truth isn't loud, it's buried.